Welcome to Now You See TV. I'm your host, Jake Grant, and tonight we have a great show for you guys. We're joined by Isaac Stropes, and we're going to be discussing the anniversary of Yeshua and diving into the Passover, what the Passover means. Isaac has just finished up a book and published a book that he'll be telling us a little bit about later on. But before I introduce Isaac, I want anybody who's joining us to know if you want to ask questions later on during the show, you can jump over to the nowuctv.org fellowship chat. It's go to nowuctv.org and click the live show link. And there you can find our chat, which you can ask questions. I'll be asking Isaac questions from that later on in the show. So, Isaac, welcome to Now You See TV. How you doing?
Thank you. Doing well. How are you?
Doing pretty good.
Good.
Hanging out here at John's house, doing a little house sitting for him, and and looking forward to this episode. Really, I met Isaac at the Declaring from the End from the Beginning conference a few a month or two back, and it was so great meeting him and Lex B. Meyer and just hanging out with the guys and fellowshipping at that conference. And we struck up a relationship, and I invited Isaac to come on here because he blew me away with some stuff when we were discussing Passover, and I didn't even know he had been working on a book during that time. And since the last time we had him on Now You See TV, right after the conference, he's finished up the book and it's ready for people to check out. But I'm really looking forward to tonight's show. The Passover season is very significant. Of course, it's one of the spring feasts, and it's often one that people, they take it or leave it in the modern Christian church. They can tend to say, "Oh, Jesus came and fulfilled it, so we don't have to worry about that." But
Mm.
I think what we're about to learn tonight from Isaac is just the depth of the Passover season and what it meant to the Messiah. And so I'm really excited. So Isaac, go ahead and kind of introduce us to what you're going to be talking about tonight.
Thanks, brother. Well, you said that the most of the church tends to kind of reject or at least be neutral towards Passover, and that's correct. In fact, to be honest, my book was written more for Christians. Now, don't get me wrong. Half the book is going to be extremely fascinating, or I hope it will be anyways. How about that? I hope it'll be extremely interesting to Messianics and Torah, the keepers of, whatever you want to call yourself, Hebrew roots. We're all one body. But there's part of the book that's written directly towards Christians, which is explaining the joy of the feast kind of in a way that they could understand it. Monty Judah says that keeping Passover is the most Christian thing we can do. And I find it ironic that, by the way, if you hear my kids in the background, I apologize. I find it ironic that so many times, whether through ignorance or a lack of desire, but in my experience, it's usually actually a lack of experiencing Passover. Christians reject it. And oftentimes I find that when a Christian is exposed to Passover, they immediately fall in love with it because of the joy and because of the deepness of the feast. It's just so amazing. And it's definitely one of my favorite feasts. And Sukkot's probably my favorite, but Passover is definitely my second favorite.
I know personally the first feast that I ever really jumped into and was able to keep was Passover, and I think that's really what hooked me and drew me into just having a desire to keep the other feasts. Because if Passover has just got all
Mm.
these images of our Messiah and about our Messiah, then why not do these other feasts that I have no idea about? So yeah, you're definitely right. It's it's really easy for Christians to be drawn into it.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like Passover is kind of the blaring neon light that advertises we're open. It's like the Torah is a store and Passover is a neon light. It says, "Come on in." Um, Someone who's never kept the Sabbath will think that the Sabbath is bondage, which is irony since it's literally the thing that God used to teach us not to be slaves. They'll be like, Sukkot, what's that? I don't know what that is. Camping for 8 days. Ugh. Of course, I love camping, but the Passover is just so blaringly obvious, and it really draws us in. And I hope what I present tonight will really connect to that part of Christianity that says, hey, you have a deep love for your Messiah, for our Messiah. Now let me show you why that deep love for our Messiah is connected to Passover. And so I really tried hard to do that, to show them, hey, this is something that, your Messiah would care about. Maybe you should too. We got a question here. What do you say to people who take the command, as oft as you do this in memory of me? That I didn't see the rest of it. Oh,
I'll
how do I?
I'll go ahead and I'll ask those questions later on once we kind of
Okay.
get rolling. So you can
Okay.
go ahead
Cool.
and start giving us kind of the backdrop of Passover, and
All right.
I'll field these questions whenever they fit in.
Awesome. Okay, sorry about that. So, yeah, the one thing I want to start out with is talking about the history of Passover. A lot of people don't know that the history of the sacrifice of Passover predates the Torah. It predates the first Exodus, and so what we see is a common practice which God used to convey a message to the children of Israel. And someone might say, well, is that pagan? My response would, first of all, be pagans didn't exist back then. Unbelievers did, and believers in other religions, but not technically pagans. But the answer to that is no. I'm going to say this. Anything God does is not pagan. And if God chooses to speak using a message, that's his ability. He speaks using our language. So what would keep him from speaking using our metaphors and our word pictures? Because that's what Passover is. Passover is a picture. And so people who might normally object to this concept that the sacrifice predated the first Passover, really they just have to look at it that way. God speaks through prophets in the language they speak. He doesn't speak to us in his language. In fact, he dumbs down what he has to say, because he says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways are not your ways. We can't even think. If he spoke to us at his level, it'd be beyond our comprehension. So he already changes what he's thinking so that we can understand it. And so is it a big deal to understand that he takes this sacrifice that exists and says, here's a picture that you understand. Now let me teach you something. Yeshua did the same thing when he taught. He taught using parables, and he taught about using the ideas of farming and things like that, shepherding, because it's what the people understood. So that being said, I want to read you guys a quote from my book. I'll just do a quick, if you can see it from the light, there's my book right there. Anyways, shameless, what's it called? Plug. Um, to quote my father-in-law, I am a professional. I can be bought. No, that's a joke actually, but okay, so it says this is H.C. Trumbull. H.C. or H. Clay Trumbull was a scholar, and he traveled throughout the Near East, and did a lot of studies of the Semitic peoples, and discovered some pretty amazing things. The books he wrote on covenants are absolutely amazing. He is a big inspiration, I know, to teachers like Rico Cortez. I haven't had Rico tell me that, but I just recognize a lot of his research in Rico's teachings, and I know Rico's read his books. And of course, I have a high respect for Rico. So I just want to say that's who my source is H.C. Trumbull, and you could find his books on Kindle, on Amazon, or whatever. But he says, long before that day, a covenant welcome was given to a guest who was to become as one of the family, or to a bride or bridegroom in marriage, by the outpouring of blood on the threshold of the door, and by the standing of the door itself with the blood of the covenant. So what this is talking about, obviously, is the Passover sacrifice. When a Near Eastern or a Semitic family wanted to welcome a guest and adopt them as part of their family, or when there was going to be a marriage, they would sacrifice an animal at the doorpost and pour the blood in the threshold or the basin and put the blood on the doorpost, just like they did at Passover. Now, I want to clarify one thing here. This is very important to understand. The Passover sacrifice, as depicted in Exodus, only happened one time. Once. There is not a single single piece of history or evidence or Bible verse that says that we are to sacrifice lambs and put blood on the doorpost. That is a grave error. And I know people who I respect who teach that, and frankly, that's just wrong. I don't know how else to say it. It's just wrong. I explained that in my book. But this one-time event at Passover, I'm going to explain why it was a one-time event. So they basically, for two reasons, they would do the sacrifice normally: for a marriage or for an adoption. So my first question is it possible for people to adopt God? I think it's a pretty obvious answer. No way. I can't adopt God. You know, he's not my son. I'm his son. You know, it's like the question Yeshua asked of the Pharisees: how can David say to his son and call him Lord? You know, because his son, that is Yeshua, is greater than David. And so our Messiah is greater than us. We cannot adopt him. In fact, one day we'll be adopted and we'll become sons of God. And so through adoption, that is. And so we know that this wasn't an idea of adoption. Well, the only thing left then is marriage. So, the question becomes, well, is it possible for God to have married the children of Israel? And the answer is yes. In fact, the Bible says this is what happened. We just oftentimes don't recognize it. Jeremiah says, actually, I'll read it to you here. Jeremiah 3. May have underlined. I might just have to quote it to you. It says, Jeremiah says, "Though I led you out of Egypt as a husband to you." And so the statement there is that, and I apologize, I can't find the exact verse. I believe it's Jeremiah 3 or Jeremiah 31, one of the two. But he says, "Though I led you out of Egypt as a husband," which means he was a husband before we left Egypt. Well, most people teach that the marriage happens at Mount Sinai. And there's some actual theological problems with that I don't think people have realized when they teach that. There is a type of imagery that can be associated with marriage there. I'm not going to deny that. But if we say that that's exactly when the children of Israel married Yeshua, then there's some problems. Because what happens at Mount Sinai? The giving of the law. Mm-hmm. If we say that marriage happened with the giving of the law, what's a requirement for marriage?
The law.
The law. So salvation is a function of marriage. He saves us, he redeems us, he buys us back. And if we say, and this would be a much larger teaching that I don't have time. It'd probably be 2 hours by itself. But if we say that we were married to him at Mount Sinai, we're really saying that we're saved by the law. And I wish I had the time to prove that. And I had it. I don't even go through that in my book because honestly, I didn't think I needed to, but I probably should have. But anyways, so we can see that this is concept of marriage in the ancient Near East, where they would slaughter a lamb, put the blood on the doorpost and the blood in the basin, and then the guest would pass over the threshold and go into the house and become. Then of course you'd have the wedding feast. And so what we see is an example of Yeshua passing over the thresholds, going into the house and marrying the children of Israel in Egypt at Passover.
Isaac, this whole concept that the Passover and the putting of the blood on the door was a concept that predated that Exodus moment from Egypt is super interesting. It's showing that, just like you said, that God was communicating with his people through ways that they understood, through customs that they understood. And something that reminds me of is the whole process of the splitting of the calf and walking through hand in hand with Abraham, which, I'm sure that, God didn't need to do that in order to kind of make a covenant or whatever with Abraham, but he did it for Abraham's sake to demonstrate that, look, I'm going to go through this, walk through this calf, and you're going to fall asleep. I'm just going to do it by myself,
Right.
And I know that was something that was done, the blood packs. So yeah, just it's really interesting that that's something that predated we think that it was just something that was commanded during that Exodus moment, but it was actually a concept that they fully understood. And so whenever he asked them to do that, it had such a deep meaning behind it that we don't realize today in our modern mindset.
Exactly. And it's kind of like if I wrote a book about traveling across the United States, I may say I went to get gas, but it would be understood in our culture today that that meant I drove up to a gas station. And by gas, I mean gasoline. And by gasoline, I mean fuel based on oil. And you can go on and on and on. I put a credit card, and a credit card is this, and a machine is this. You could spend a book explaining what it means to get gas. Or in our culture, you can just say, I went to get gas. And in the same way, the Bible oftentimes alludes to things like this and uses common phrases and terms that was so commonly understood and so obvious, it doesn't feel the need to explain it. If it did, I think if the Bible explained every single thing that it said in the detail that we would need it today to understand they did, the Bible would probably be volumes thick, much more thicker than it is. And so, so there's so many things in the Bible that we can discover through research and through study that is not apparent at first blush, when we first go through it. And that's not to say that it's really about hidden knowledge. I believe that the Bible as it was written, if read to a 8-year-old during the time of Yeshua, would have been extremely easy to understand and obvious. The problem is that we're 4 languages apart, we're a continent away, and we're 2,000 years later. We're from Hebrew to Greek to Latin to English, and so you're dealing with a huge knowledge gap, a huge culture gap. And in my opinion, it's extremely arrogant to assume that we can automatically understand that. Can God show us things? Sure he can. I was trying to explain the covenant of Abraham to someone one day. I think it was a covenant of Abraham. I was explaining something about Torah to a mainstream Christian. And as I was leading up to it, he was like, oh, it's interesting you're mentioning the subject because the other day I was praying and the Holy Spirit showed me something. And he literally laid out the entire theory. And I know he had never heard this theory. This is a messianic theory or a Hebrew roots theory. This is not a theory that Christians know. And he just it was so weird. It was like a download. I just all of a sudden understood this. I was like blown away. I was like, the Holy Spirit showed that to you. That's crazy. And so that can happen, but there's also a need for study and research. And so I want to be careful when I say it's not some hidden knowledge that we're a few who seek out. That's an Illuminati idea, if they exist. That's that conspiratorial, and that's not what the Bible's about.
We're definitely not pro Illuminati on this.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, that's right. Heck no. We only have one master and Lord. So anyways, understanding that this was a common practice for the time for a marriage, and seeing that Jeremiah says that God married Israel in Egypt, it then becomes obvious that Passover is a marriage ceremony. Have you ever wondered why circumcision is required for Passover? It seems kind of like a random rule, Well, what's circumcision? It's the sign of the covenant, right? It's not making the covenant, it's the sign of the covenant. It's the wedding ring, right? Circumcision is a sign of the covenant. It means you've been married. Passover is the anniversary. So you cannot celebrate my wife and I's anniversary. If we throw a party, you may come, but you cannot join us. We're sitting there eating at a steak restaurant. You're like, hey guys, just thought I'd sit down with you. What's going on? And we're like, we're celebrating an anniversary. Oh, great. Did you get me a card? Well, no, we didn't. No, because it's our anniversary, And in the same way, if we're not in covenant with the Messiah, we have no right to celebrate that anniversary. And so that's why you have to be circumcised. And frankly, you have to be a believer as well, because you have to be married to him. And so it's interesting. I think Jews would be counted in that category as well with believers, because he also married them. They're not saved yet, but they are. I'd have to study that out. That's an interesting thought. I don't know what I think about that.
Now, Isaac, this topic of going through the process of circumcision to participate in Passover is an extremely controversial and difficult topic to discuss with church people. First and foremost, there's always the misconception that, through talking about the process of circumcision and it being a commandment that still holds for today, automatically it always goes towards, oh, you're teaching a works-based salvation. Look how Paul addressed that with the in Acts and the different situations where he either didn't circumcise somebody or he did circumcise somebody, um, and I think maybe if you could just kind of explain how circumcision is not part of a works-based salvation, but something that follows and is a willful choice of somebody who has put faith in the Messiah first and foremost, because this is such a controversial topic, and why does this tie to the keeping of the feast?
So, first of all, there's two types of circumcision, as we know. There's circumcision of the flesh, which I don't think I have to really state this, but is only done to men, and there's a circumcision of the heart, which is for everyone. The circumcision of the flesh came before the law. It came before Passover. It came from Abraham. It's from the covenant of friendship. I think we talked about that last time. The covenant of strong friendship that God made with Abraham. And so you could actually argue that circumcision is outside of the law. Even Yeshua said it didn't come from the law, but it came from the fathers. And so saying that if you're trying to be circumcised, you're trying to be saved by the law, my response would be, well, then you don't know the Torah, because circumcision came before the law. And in fact, salvation for the Jews happened after Passover, not before. So let's think about that. First you're circumcised, then you're married, then you're saved. Most people believe that circumcision, they're jumping steps. They're saying, oh, well, if you're circumcised, you're trying to be saved. And my response would be, no, not at all. Salvation comes after that. That's later. Circumcision is saying, I want to align myself with my Messiah. I want to make a covenant of friendship with my Messiah. I want to pledge my allegiance and my loyalty to him as his slave. And it's a covenant of friendship. And so there is nothing about circumcision that has to do with salvation. But here's the caveat to that. I think it's Ezekiel, maybe Isaiah, says that no one, and this is talking about the last days, no one will enter his temple who is not circumcised in the flesh and in the heart. And the context is going to worship at the end of days when Yeshua returns and the kingdom is set up. So we can see from this verse, and I apologize, I'm just talking about it off the hand, so I don't remember where it's at, that circumcision is going to be required in the kingdom. And so this is what I tell my friends. I said, you're not required to get circumcised right now, maybe. But what are you going to do when you look at your 13-year-old son and as you're sharpening a knife and you say, sorry, son, I was trying to prove a point that I didn't have to do it then. Do you want to go into the kingdom or not? And he's like, Dad, why didn't you do this when I was a baby? What foolish parent, what foolish and wicked parent would put their child through that in the future? Sorry about the noise. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. So what parent would put their child through that in the future? I hope no one. I hope they all choose to obey the Torah and circumcise, not for salvation, but for obedience sake.
Now, Isaac, I guarantee you there's some guys out there right now who are crossing their legs, scratching their heads, saying, what am I watching right now? And people who are just coming into Torah, who what do you have to say for somebody who's not gone through that process, that is in their adulthood?
My response would be, first of all, use a doctor. You're not Abraham, and we have technology that Abraham didn't have. Go to a doctor, save up the money, and and they'll knock you out. I know it can be done. I know of at least 2 men who were circumcised as adults. I won't say their names because that's a pretty private thing. But I know one who did it surgically, and it was, I'm sure, not very painful because they knocked him out and he healed pretty quickly. How many of us would consider getting, a dentist says, "Oh, your teeth are really bad. You need dentures." Or not dentures. What do they call it? Braces? Okay, no problem. We do that as teenagers. Or a doctor says, I'm trying to think of a good example. The doctor says, "Hey, your cholesterol's high. You need to lose some weight." So we work out. That's a bad example because I'm overweight and fat. Um, but my point is that we go to a medical practitioner and they say we need to do this operation or procedure, and we do it. The Torah says that we need to do this operation or procedure. And so I would just say, do it. It may take years for you to work up the courage and save the money, because I think it's a couple $1,000s to pay someone to do it, but it'll be worth it when you're not doing it in the wilderness. And secondly, it's a covenant of strong friendship. You want that friendship with God. He wants to be friends with you. So just do it. Obey. I don't know what else to say. It's hard to say anything else because, I don't know. What would I do if I had to go through that? I'd be shaking, I'd be
Yeah, I know
scared.
that was a bit of a rabbit trail, but I know bringing up
Yeah,
that topic, a lot of people watching, there's always someone out there who takes it and twists it or doesn't understand kind of what's being presented or talked about. So thank you for kind of explaining that position on circumcision a little bit in a more deeper way.
sure. And I know it's kind of just practical, like, sorry about the crying kid in the background. I know it's more practical of me saying, like, just do it. Unfortunately, I'm not a doctor. I can't give details on what that would require, and I've never had to experience that, and so I can't give more detail. But yeah, it's. I'm gonna change the subject a little bit. Um, we talked about we. What about those circumcised at birth? I'd say you're good. Um, um, it's a sign in your flesh, and if you already bear that sign, in my opinion, I think you're good. The Bible does not say you must be circumcised by a believer. The Bible does not say you must be circumcised in a specific way, except for on the 8th day. And so basically, if you're circumcised, you're good because it's a sign in your flesh, and it's very obvious. And I don't want to go into detail because that's a little bit crude on
Yeah,
life.
you're good, Isaac. You can go
YouTube.
ahead.
All right, thank you. Um, not many things can make me blush. Anyways, let me collect my thoughts for just a second. I kind of got distracted there. We talked about circumcision not being required for salvation, being before or after it. We talked about, where were we? I was kind of leading to something, and I'm trying to remember where I was at in the process. We talked about the first Passover. Okay. So we talked about how the first Passover is an anniversary. That's where we were at. Okay. The first Passover is an anniversary celebration. And so the commandment to keep Passover is really a commandment to celebrate our anniversary. It's funny because it's not a commandment that people would think is burdensome to celebrate your anniversary. Americans go out to nice dinners and stay in hotels or go see a movie, get babysitters, things like that, and we think nothing of it. And so we do it with joy. And so I would just encourage you, if you believe that you're married to our Messiah, Yeshua, which if you're watching this, you probably do, then why not celebrate your anniversary with great joy? When you realize that Passover is about that, man, it becomes something else. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. So if the first Passover was an anniversary celebration, what about now? Well, in Jeremiah, it talks about God divorcing Israel. And this actually shocks a lot of people I talk to. Not many Messianics or Hebrew roots people are shocked by this because they usually know this verse. But when I tell people that, God divorced, or Yeshua divorced Israel. They're like, no, he didn't. God hates divorce. He would never divorce. And then I'm like, well, Jeremiah. And Jeremiah 3:8 says, then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. So God put her away and then gave her a certificate of divorce. And not to get into this too much, but there's two elements to divorce in the Hebrew days. There's the putting away, which is sending out of your house, and then there's the writing a certificate of divorce. The writing of the certificate of divorce gives an actual legal proof to the wife that she is divorced, and this allows her to remarry. So, for instance, in Yeshua's day, many Jews would send their wives away and would never give her a certificate of divorce. And Yeshua actually references this when he's teaching, but because it's translated into English, we miss it. He says that you have heard it said, well, shoot, I don't know if I can quote it for detail, but basically when Yeshua talks about divorce, he talks about if you send her away without a divorce, that you're causing her to commit adultery. The context is sending her away, but not giving her a certificate of divorce. And so then she's still technically married to you. And so if she goes and tries to remarry another, which she has to for her substance back then she's committing adultery. And Yeshua was saying, don't do that. If you're going to get a divorce, you need to send her away and write her a certificate of divorce. It's kind of ironic that most people read that verse and they think that Yeshua is saying that you can't get divorced, and that's not true. He's saying you need to divorce your wife legally so that she can be remarried and be provided for, and you don't harm her in the long run, that you be fair and equitable with your wife. So anyways, Yeshua divorced Israel in Jeremiah 3 and sent her away. And of course, that was the exile. The exile was, I'm so sorry, the exile was, it's bedtime for my kiddos. The exile was.
You're right. We can't hear him too much back there.
Okay, good. Okay. Oh, it's really loud to me. The exile was a divorce, sending her away, literally. Judah and Israel were sent out of the land. They were sent away. And so Judah was brought back because Judah was never actually divorced. Only Israel was. And so Israel was divorced, but yet Jeremiah says, return to me. And this might be something that a lot of people know, but this might be new to a lot of people. I just got a loud noise. Can you still hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, let me. If you can't hear me anymore, just start waving or something.
All right,
in case my phone, Okay, I think we're okay.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So Yeshua divorced Israel, and then he says, return to me. In the same chapter, he says, you have heard it said that if man divorces his wife and she goes away and is with another lover, that she can never return. Yet I say to you, return to me. Well, of course, Jeremiah is quoting the Torah in Deuteronomy, where it talks about the law of divorce. And the Torah says that if a man divorces his wife, because he finds some uncleanness in her, and that Hebrew word for uncleanness is really talking about like some hidden sin, like adultery, or that kind of thing. But that's the context of divorce there. But he says if you divorce your wife because you find that she has some uncleanness in her, that you have to send her away. Once she's lain with another man, after that, she can never return to you. So she is basically forever cut off from your marriage. Well, Jeremiah quotes that verse and then says, but yet return to me, says the Lord. So here God is saying in his law, Israel can never return. Here God is saying Israel has been cut off. And by the way, Israel laid with many lovers. The prophets are very explicit on how Israel laid with many lovers. They do not get bashful when it comes to their adultery. And so what we see is God saying return. So the question is how? How can Israel return if they have laid with many lovers? How can they return? So Paul actually explains this in Romans. He says in Romans 7, or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. Now, when most people read Romans 7 who don't know the Torah, they read past that verse very quickly. And what I like to point out is that I say, stop, do you know the law? They're like, well, no. And then I said, so is he talking to you? And they say, yes. And I said, well, hold on, read it again. For I speak to those who know the law. And they get it. Oh, I guess he's not talking to me. And then my question is, why? And they usually don't know. The answer is because if you don't know the law, you won't understand what he's saying. Well, if you do know the law of divorce, you'll understand exactly what he's talking about. It says that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. Which law? The law of marriage. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So then if while her husband lives, she marries another man, she'll be called an adulteress. This is talking about divorce and remarriage, saying that if she's married to another man and she tries to marry someone else, she's obviously committing adultery. But if the husband dies, that she's freed from that law. So the context here is that Paul is going on to explain how can Israel return to Yeshua? And the answer is simple. If the man dies, she's no longer married to him. And this is actually how we know who married Israel, because the father never died, right? An angel never died. So if it was an angel or the father, no one thinks it's an angel, but I'm just using that as an example. If it's an angel or the father who married Israel, then they can never return. But if Yeshua, who we know died, married Israel, then they could return. And so the call to return is in reality a prophecy of a death, that the Messiah would die so that his bride Israel could return to him. And that's one of the reasons Yeshua had to die, is so that Israel could return. And so when we realize that, it becomes much more severe, realizing that our master, our Lord, our future husband, and I use that in quotes because it's using human language, he died so that we could return to him. We talked about the covenant of Abraham and the death of Yeshua, and how the day Yeshua died was determined by the covenant of Abraham last time, and how Yeshua died as a covenant keeper. Here we see another example of Yeshua dying as the covenant keeper. Though you break my covenant and I have to divorce you, yet I will die in order to bring you back. So Yeshua dies and resurrects and becomes, as Paul says, a new man, so that he can take Israel back. So seeing that, the answer is obviously that if Israel was divorced, then Israel has to be married again in order for Passover to be an anniversary. So if there is no Passover that's linked to that anniversary, then there's no celebration of Passover in the same way. But there is. The night before he died, Yeshua kept Passover. And understanding that Yeshua is the one who married Israel, Yeshua is the one who, the Passover is a celebration of the anniversary. Now, when we read these verses about Passover, they have such a deeper meaning, because we start to see that Passover is about our celebration with him. And so it says, when he took the cup and gave it thanks and gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for the many for the remission of sins. And so at that Passover, Yeshua betrothed us to himself and made a covenant with us again. So now this Passover once again becomes a covenant celebration for Israel. It's always been for Judah because they were never divorced, but Israel was. And so Israel, and when I say Israel, perhaps I should explain real quickly who that is. So Israel is the northern tribes, what was left of them. By tradition, we say 10 tribes. Historically and biblically, that's not actually accurate, but by tradition, we say 10 tribes. And they were scattered. They were conquered by the Assyrians and taken away into captivity and scattered into all the world. And it's prophesied many, many times in the Bible that Israel will return. Return, O Israel. And yet they have not. There's so many prophecies that the Messiah will bring Israel back. That's one of the major arguments that the Jews use to try to prove that he's not the Messiah. course, what they don't understand is that he's going to bring them back at his second coming. And so Israel right now is scattered into all the nations, and Israel receives specific judgments from the Lord. Exile and divorce is one, of course, but there's several spoken of in Hosea, that they would walk in darkness, that they would eat unclean things, that they would no longer have sacrifices or the altar, that they would no longer have the Sabbath or the feasts and the new moons. So there's another identification we can use to find Israel, because the promise of Abraham, that through Abraham all the nations, all the Gentiles of the earth would be blessed, is a promise that somehow these Gentiles that we call Israel would also be connected to Abraham. So if we're looking for Israel, we need to look for people who have the faith of Abraham, who reject kosher, who reject the Sabbath, who reject the feasts, who reject the Torah, because the reference to walking in darkness is walking without the law. Your law is a light. And who reject the new moons and the feasts. Well, I think everybody who hears that is like, oh, he just described Christians, mainstream Christians. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. Mainstream Christians are some of scattered Israel. And that's how they're going to return. As a side note, what's interesting is I've been told by, I heard Monty Judah say it, that that the Jews teach that when Ephraim or Israel returns, that they'll know who the Messiah is. And the Jews will ask him, who is the Messiah? And so it's crazy to think that all these Jews are sitting there, and all of a sudden this flood of Ephraim/Israel comes in. Millions and millions of people from all over the world comes into Jerusalem, and the Jews say, who is the Messiah? And they turn around and say, Yeshua HaMashiach. And they're just like, mind blown. But anyways, so we can see that Israel is scattered throughout all the world, and that it's made up of Gentiles. And so who is called to keep Passover? Israel and Judah, those in covenant. By the way, if you're in covenant with Yeshua, you're either a member of the house of Israel or a member of the house of Judah, and that's it. If you're not physically one, you're adopted in. Caleb, a lot of people don't know this, Caleb was not a Jew or an Israelite. He was a descendant of Esau. He was a descendant of Esau, but he was adopted in. He was the leader of the tribe of Judah. He was a Gentile, but he was a leader of the tribe of Judah. Elijah, a lot of people get bothered by this. I don't know why. You think Elijah was a Jew? I remember the Jews also called themselves Tishbeites, right? The house of Tishbe, that's what Esau. No, he was a Gentile. Elijah, the greatest prophet of all of Israel, was a Gentile. Technically, so was Abraham. But then again, when he was circumcised and became part of the covenant, he became a member of God's family. So the point is that anybody who seeks to join the kingdom of God becomes a member of the house of Israel or Judah, if they're Jews, and they become a part of one body, one kingdom, to celebrate with our Messiah. And Passover then becomes a celebration of our covenant with him, our anniversary celebration. Every Christian gets to keep Passover. And when I say Christian now, I mean Torah observant, Hebrew roots, Messianic, whatever. I don't care. Whatever you call yourself, Baptist, Protestant, Catholic, if you believe in Yeshua, you now have the chance to celebrate Passover, to celebrate the anniversary of our Lord. How amazing is that? How amazing is that? That's just such an honor. Such an honor.
Wow,
So,
when you describe just the identity of Israel, and how Christians are often the ones who reject the feast, reject the Sabbath, reject Torah, and they're eating the unclean foods, and that's exactly the prophecy that was talked about in Hosea. Man, that just goosebumps all over. Man, that's that's the truth. Is because they are the ones who they have that faith of Abraham, but then they don't realize the identity that comes along with what the Messiah has done for us, and that's so powerful. And our identity is tied to keeping the Sabbaths and keeping the feasts. It's called a sign throughout Scripture, and it's really interesting that people who start to realize their identity as Israel, not just the house of the church or the house of Gentile, but as Israel, that whenever they start to keep these feasts and they start to keep Passover, they realize their heritage as as the nation of Israel, as someone grafted in.
That's right, and it's so amazing because I think it was Jim Robs no Jim Staley, yeah, Jim Staley, who had a teaching on this that was just absolutely revolutionary when I was just coming to Torah and an understanding of keeping Torah, realizing that that our identity is wrapped up in Him, and that offers us the chance to keep the feasts. And I want to read one more verse. You know, you said that was how amazing it was, and I agree. Just to realize that Israel is Christians, and they're called to keep Torah and the feasts. So when I grew up in the church, I grew up as a mainstream Christian. I'm still a Christian, obviously. So are you. Some people reject the term Christian, but I don't care what term you call yourself. We're really Christians. We're followers of Christ, followers of Messiah. You know, Messianic and Christian literally mean the same thing. But so we're believers in Yeshua, and I grew up in like a charismatic, non-denominational style household, and in our church they always read this verse when they're talking about the return of the Lord. It says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to the fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse." So this is a very common phrase in Christianity. It's interesting because they don't read the verse before it. So the verse before it says, "Remember the Torah of Moses my servant, which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel." For all Israel. We just saw who Israel was, with the statutes and the judgments. So that automatically disproves this crap going around that, you know, it's only the 10 Commandments, or that, oh, we're all priests and part of the law has been done away with. Oh, I can't stand that idea. Anyways, I gotta not think about that because it frustrates me. So there's a teacher teaching that everybody's a priest and therefore basically we don't have to keep the Torah. Anyways, it says, "Which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel with the statutes and the judgments. Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." So Elijah the prophet, when he arrives, wherever he's at, I think he's probably going to be a Gentile, and he's going to probably show up in Israel one day, and he's going to be calling scattered Israel to return to the Torah, and that is the hearts. That is, that their hearts would turn to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then their fathers' hearts, the Torah, would return to them. So there's a keeping of the Torah that Israel needs to call, and that's what Elijah's the prophet, whoever he is, and we don't know when he's going to arrive, maybe, hopefully within our lifetime, but whoever he is, he will rise up and say, "Return, O Israel." And so that is part of the proof that I show to my mainstream Christian brothers that, hey, Elijah the prophet, who by the way is one of the two witnesses here, is going to be calling all Christians to keep Torah. So why would we not keep it now? Of course, he says he'll strike the earth with a curse if they don't listen. And what does God do in Revelation? Strikes the earth with a lot of curses. So anyways, that was a side note. I didn't really plan on talking about that, but I just wanted to mention that the call of a prophet is always going to be for those to return to his Torah. There are a few prophets out there, I think, personally. I've watched a few speak over the internet, and legitimate prophets who are calling for people to obey God and repent from lawlessness and idolatry, and not the kind who are faking, divination and stuff like that. Anyways, that's a whole other subject. I don't know why I brought that up. So my point is that Israel is called to keep Torah. Israel has been given the opportunity. When I say Israel, I mean Gentiles, I mean Christians, I mean scattered Israel. They have been given the opportunity to keep the Passover feast with their Messiah, with their Lord, with their King, with their future husband, as an anniversary celebration of the date he betrothed himself to us. Now, here's my question. You're not married, but imagine if you were married and you told your wife, I don't really want to celebrate our anniversary. How do you think that would go over? You don't have to be married to imagine that, right? Any man who's ever been in a relationship, or any woman who's ever had a relationship, knows how that would go over. It would be, oh no. My wife would be like, what'd you say? Uh, no. And so, of course, what spouse would not want to celebrate their anniversary, right? And so, but so many times we don't want to celebrate our master's anniversary. We reject his Passover because we call it bondage. Now, how many of us will be brokenhearted if our spouse called love for us bondage, and celebration of that love bondage? It's not bondage. It's joy. It's freedom. It's literally a freedom feast. That's the irony. Passover is a celebration of freedom. That we were once slaves and now we're free, and somehow that's been turned into the idea of bondage. It's not real to me, So understanding that Passover is an anniversary celebration, understanding that it's a celebration of our marriage to him, or actually our betrothal to him, because Jeremiah says that in the days that we're actually married to him, that no man will teach his neighbor. And we know from the fact that we teach that that's not the case right now. And so we understand that the marriage is going to happen in the kingdom when all is fulfilled. Yeshua said, I will not drink of this cup until all has been accomplished. Well, that's speaking of the first Passover in the kingdom when we're married to him. The first Passover in the kingdom will be a celebration of our marriage to him. Okay. And that's when he'll drink of the fourth cup, which is the cup of, it's in my book, and here we go. It's the cup of praise, which comes from the statement, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. So when does he take us to be his people? When we're married to him, right? Which happens at the end of days. And that's why he can take the cup again, the fourth cup, and drink it in joy at our Passover with him. And then every year we'll remember the covenant we make with him. Every year will truly be a celebration. And actually, Passover, in Zechariah, I think it is, I hope it's Zechariah, it says that that those who survive the tribulation, who are not part of the kingdom, they're cast out. Okay. Technically, the outer darkness is part of the kingdom. It's just not where the feasting is, right? So the land of Israel and Jerusalem is where the kingdom's at. And then there's nations all around Israel, obviously, in the world. And they're cast down. That's called outer darkness, okay? Because outer darkness is a reference to where the feasting is not being held. That's a whole other thing. They would have feasting at night, and they would light the rooms. And so if you were locked out of the feast, it was said that you were in outer darkness. So anyways, those people, they're commanded, they're given the opportunity, but they're also commanded to return to Jerusalem once a year for the Feast of Tabernacles. And it says that if they don't, that whole nation would not receive rain that year. That's a pretty severe punishment. Think about it. Without rain, what happens? Your crops die. So you go hungry and you start to starve. And so, but that commandment for Passover doesn't exist. You know why? Obviously, it's because you have to be in covenant to keep Passover. Once again, this is a reward for those who are in covenant. I've made the statement to my friends that the Torah only protects those in covenant. Okay, There are laws about those outside of the covenant, but it doesn't protect them as much. That's why someone who's outside of the covenant, you can give them an animal that's been torn by beasts because they're not protected. They're not in covenant. Just like in the United States, our Constitution only protects those in the United States. If I go to Mexico and I'm like, well, you can't do that to me because I'm going to quote the Fifth Amendment, they're going to be like, okay, what does that do? It's not law. It's not our country, you know? So only those in a country who uphold that law and live under that law, that's who is protected by the law, is the people in the country. So the same way, those in the kingdom of God are the ones protected by the Torah. And so you have to be in covenant to keep Passover. I want to talk about some objections to this concept because basically there was kind of an evolution of thought that happened about Passover. It started with people suggesting that Passover is on the 15th, which is an understandable statement. I studied Passover for 5 years to write this book. Okay, actually I didn't study to write it, but I mean I studied it for 5 years, very in depth, studying almost everything I can get my hands on. The only thing I didn't reference extensively was the Talmud, because I just don't value the Talmud like some people do. I hope that doesn't offend people. I don't value it that much. I value it as a historical source, but that's about it. And I hope I don't offend any of my Jewish brothers by saying that, but that's just that's the book of Isaac, okay? That's who I am. But I studied all kinds of history and all kinds of books and referenced all kinds of material. And I studied the commandments over and over. You know what I found out? You can read the commandments to 100% prove that you should keep the Passover on the 14th. And you can read the commandments to 100% prove that you should keep Passover on the 15th. Depends on how you read them. Now, the commandments alone. Now, the New Testament and history actually prove that Passover is on the 14th. Okay? But the Torah, if you just ignore the New Testament and you ignore, for instance, I think they're called the Quartodecimans. It's 14 in Latin, basically. If you ignore Quartodecimans, if you ignore history of those people, then you can argue either side, and they would both have really valid points. So before I start talking about this controversy, I want to say that. I also want to say that I would rather someone keep Passover and be obedient to God. And so if you find that you're angry when I talk about this, that you're like, oh, he proved that it was the 14th or whatever. If you're going to use it to attack people, just go ahead and just stop watching. Because this doesn't need to be a cause of division among our brothers. We don't need to take our anniversary celebration and use it to attack people. And we definitely don't want to attack the servants of our master, because then the master comes to us and says, why'd you attack my servant? So I want to say that before I bring up any of the controversial stuff. There's a reason I bring it up. But it's very important that we walk in humility and kindness with each other. I told you before, I had my best friend Lex and I debated this topic for 5 years. We're closer now to get to the same opinion than we were before, but it's never affected our friendship, not once. We've had some arguments. We've had some discussions, lots of discussions, only a few arguments, and I've done a little bit of trolling, but sometimes I can be a troll. But older people are like, what is he talking about? What's a troll? Anyways, but I just want to stress that this conversation we're having here should not be used to attack or divide. Passover is a familial feast. It's a feast done in the home, and the head of the house decides how it's celebrated. So if a husband decides that it should be kept a certain way, that's how you keep it. I don't have a right to tell each family how to keep it. They have a right to answer to their Lord how they keep it. I'm going to tell you my opinion, and then you can decide what you're going to do with it. So the first thing that people do is they point to John and they say that, actually, I feel kind of led to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about something. I might come back to this, but I'm going to talk about something else. It's been on my heart for a long time, and I think it's very important. I want to talk about because the timing of the Passover is important. But I'm going to give you a 1 second answer. I believe the Passover is kept on the evening starting the 14th, specifically that night. So the night of the 14th is when Passover occurs. Yeshua kept it on the 14th. The Jews kept it on the 15th, as dictated by John. Uh, you'll notice in parts of John that John says the Jews were afraid of the people. And you're like, wait, what? The Jews are afraid of the Jews? Why? Well, he's using, obviously, if you read John enough, you'll come to realize that John describes the leaders of the people as the Jews. Okay? And so when he says the Passover of the Jews drew near, he's talking about the Passover of the Pharisees. And we know from history that the Jews, the Jewish people, that is, not the Jews, the Jewish people actually kept two different dates for Passover. The Essenes kept Passover on the 14th. The Pharisees kept it on the 15th. Monty Judah also says there's evidence. I haven't seen it, but he has talked to me about it. There's evidence that the Sadducees kept it on the 14th as well. So we have the Sadducees and the Essenes. I know that the Essenes kept it because there's historical proof. I believe it's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, if I remember correctly. I reference it in my book. But there's historical proof the Essenes kept it on the 14th. And the Pharisees, we know from the Talmud that the Pharisees kept it on the 15th. And so what we have is division even 2,000 years ago over when Passover should be kept. And so I don't believe that my book will all of a sudden solve world peace and everybody will agree and sing Kumbaya. I wish that would happen with Passover. You know, everybody, oh, it's amazing. He's right. Okay, let's all agree. All right, we're good. Now we're unified. That's not going to happen. You know, I heard a saying, if you get, I'm Jewish, so when I say this, just so you know I'm Jewish, the saying is if you get 3 Jews in a room, you'll have 12 opinions. And it's just saying that when you get intelligent people in the room, you're going to have a bunch of different opinions. And so there's going to be people who disagree with me, and that's okay. But I want to talk about a couple things. There's a group, I mentioned it earlier, who believes that you should sacrifice a lamb and put the blood in the doorpost. And we have a lot of problems with this, scripturally speaking. First of all, there is a commandment. Actually, I want to start by reading. There is a reference to Passover in 2 Chronicles that a lot of people don't know exists. And it says, then they slaughtered the Passover lambs. They slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the second month. The priest, this is talking about the second Passover, obviously, because it's the second month. This is because they didn't have the commands to keep the Passover, and they didn't keep the Passover before, so they were keeping it the second month. The priests and Levites were ashamed and sanctified themselves and brought the burnt offerings to the house of the Lord. They stood in their places according to the custom, according to the law of Moses from the man of God. The priests sprinkled the blood received from the hands of the Levites, for there were many in the assembly who had not sanctified themselves. Therefore the Levites had charge of the slaughter of the Passover lambs for everyone who was not clean, to sanctify them to the Lord. So what it's saying is the priests should have been the ones handling the blood. But the reason they were shamed is because they were unclean. Because they were unclean, they could not handle the blood. So the Levites had to do it. It's ironic the Levites were more honorable in this way. They were clean. And so what does that tell us? The priests sprinkled the blood where at? At the base of the altar. So the priests handle the blood and they put it at the base of the altar as is commanded. Now there are people who say that the Passover is to be done, that we're allowed to sacrifice a lamb. I want to deal with that first. So that is incorrect, 100% incorrect. The Torah says that if we sacrifice a lamb, and I'm going to look for it. I believe it's Deuteronomy 16. No, Leviticus 7. Sorry, I should have had this pulled up, but I didn't know I was going this way. Thought about it earlier, but okay. Leviticus 17. All right. Okay. Okay. To the end that the children of Israel may bring their sacrifices which they offer in the open field, they may bring them to the Lord at the door of the tabernacle meeting to the priests and offer them as a peace offering to the Lord. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of the Lord at the door of the tabernacle meeting and burn the fat for sweet aroma. So the context here is if you're going to slaughter an animal in Jerusalem, you bring it to the priest and they slaughter it at the altar, pour out its blood, and then you're able to take the animal home and eat it. It says, they shall no more offer their sacrifices to demons after whom they have played the harlot. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout your generations. So this tells us that those who sacrifice animals to God in an unprescribed manner are actually sacrificing to demons. Okay, this is extremely important to understand, and it is hard to hear. Okay, um, the commandment to sacrifice the lamb is always in Jerusalem. Um, Deuteronomy 16, verse 2. Therefore you shall sacrifice the Passover to the Lord your God from the flock and the herd, so a lamb or a goat, or a sheep or a goat, in the place where the Lord chooses to put his name. Now we learn from Chronicles that the place where the Lord chooses to put his name is Jerusalem. And specifically, it's also referenced to the temple. You could say Jerusalem or the temple. But the lamb is always brought to the altar to be sacrificed. So if you sacrifice the animal outside of Jerusalem, you're breaking the Torah. If you sacrifice it to worship God, you're worshiping a demon. That's the
Now,
first part.
Isaac, this really brings up a really important topic when it comes to Passover. Is often kind of one of the arguments that comes against Passover is the fact that, oh, we aren't in Jerusalem, and are you
Mhm.
suggesting we go and sacrifice lambs, and are
No.
you suggesting we, do such and such? And if we can't do these things, how are we going to even keep Passover since we're not in the land and we're not near Jerusalem? So, how do we keep Passover as a memorial, as an anniversary, when we're not in the land, when we're in the dispersion, when Israel's not returned yet? And how do we keep it according to Torah, where we're not doing it in doing what's right in our own eyes, but what's wrong in Yahweh's?
Right. So the answer to that is partially we cannot and partially we have to. Okay. So I'm going to answer with a contradiction. We cannot, in America or the world, besides Jerusalem, keep Passover. By the way, they won't let you slaughter a lamb in Jerusalem. So the actual statement is it is impossible to fully keep Passover. When I say fully, I mean sacrificing the lamb, taking it back to your house, roasting it over fire, etc., etc. Okay. The answer is we must keep Passover. So how do we do it? Well, if the sacrifice has been removed, by the way, Hosea says that's a judgment, that the sacrifices and the altar would be removed from us, then we must keep Passover in the best way we can. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians. He says like 3 different places. He instructs Gentiles to keep Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Okay. And he never mentions a lamb. Why? Because they can't, because they're Gentiles and they're Christians. If they had come to Israel, to Jerusalem, and brought a lamb to sacrifice, they would have been killed. They cannot sacrifice a lamb. So Paul tells them not, he says to partake of the wine and the bread, and of course the bitter herbs. But I think that was understood, kind of like the gasoline scenario earlier. There's things that are understood. They would have understood that along with the wine and the bitter herbs, the wine and the bread, you also eat of the bitter herbs. And
I
so,
think, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
no,
off.
no, it's okay.
But this ties directly into one of the questions we had come in from the chat, and I think it would be a good time to kind of bring it up. Is
Mhm.
Alishiba is asking, whenever he says, "Do as oft as you do this, do it in memory of me,"
Mhm.
and they take that and they transform it into what we see as like the weekly communion. How does this commandment of doing it in memory of the Messiah, what he spoke to them that night during the Last Supper, how does this relate to this whole concept of communion versus keeping a Passover?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that. I feel like I just planted someone in the audience to ask a question that was like so perfect, even though I didn't. That's a really good question. Actually, the answer is in my book, but I'm going to give it here. Obviously, that'd be kind of a jerk thing to do. The answer's in my book. Uh, so the answer is this. First of all, you're going to hear an argument from Christians that the Eucharist or communion comes from Passover, and they are right. Easter comes from Passover. They are right. Now, it's actually a mixing of paganism and unholy practices with Passover and a breaking of the commandments. But in my book, I actually trace the history using, by the way, I mostly used Catholic sources because I'm basically showing how Catholics break the Torah and how they reject the Torah and how they basically are doing wrong. And so I wanted to use a source that no one could argue with, right? So a Catholic can't go against my sources if I'm quoting Catholics. And the truth of the matter is that if you're going to quote an early church if you're going to quote a Christian scholar, you're either going to quote a Catholic or probably like a German Protestant, right? So I don't read German, so mostly I read Catholics. And so anyways, my book quotes them a lot. And what I do is I show the transformation, the evolution of Passover. It started with the changing of Passover Day to the Lord's Day. And this is where the Quartodecimeans, I always pronounce them wrong, the 14ers is what they're called. They believe that you should keep Passover on the night of the 14th. And so they actually traveled to Rome to confront the church in Rome. And they testified that John's disciple Polycarp, the apostle Thomas and his daughters, and many other apostles, and many like bishops in the Turkish, it's called the Church of Asia, but it's really Turkey. It's an Eastern church. They all kept Passover on the night of the 14th. And the Western church was arguing that it should be kept on the Lord's Day, which was the following Sunday. What's amazing to me is I also found a reference to it's like quintodecimans. There's quinto and there's quarto. One of them is 14, one of them is 15. Okay, the 15ers, the group that is a lot of times quoted by Messianics. Do you know who were the ones who espoused that belief? It was the Western Church, the Catholics. So I find it ironic that people, and I'm not trying to be mean, but people who so strongly reject the Western Church and cling to the Eastern so strongly quote the Western traditions, which, by the way, have no historical vantage point when it comes to this argument. The only historical proof weighs on the 14er side, because the apostles, John, Andrew, and others, specifically kept Passover on the 14th, the night of the 14th. And so it became there was an argument between the 14th and 15th, which eventually changed to the Lord's Day, which was a Sunday. So the Sunday following Passover, that's when Passover began to be kept. Well, then they started fasting before the Lord's Day for 2 days. So here's the ironic part. Because of the way the Hebrew calendar falls, some years they were fasting on Passover. So feasting was turned into fasting. And they rejected the command of the Lord to keep Passover, and instead started keeping their own day on the Lord's Day. Hundreds of years later, this led to the date of Easter. It actually took hundreds of years for them to get the date of Easter agreed upon. There's much in my book. I also cover the history of the Eucharist and communion and the changing of Passover into just the cracker and the wine, or the grape juice, depending on what church you go to. But I talk about how it's changed. Monty Judas says that we spill more off of a communion table or off of a Passover table than people eat for communion. And it's kind of funny, but it's true though. Anybody who's kept Passover, you eat so much food and there's just abundance everywhere. It's a feast. And I grew up eating communion, and it's like this little dry cracker that makes your mouth all dry, and then you drink the little grape juice because you're a kid. And you're like, oh, I want more, and you try to sneak and get more grape juice, and it's like a game. And it's not a feast, though, you know. And here's the ironic part. What do Christians say that the Resurrection Sunday or Easter? What do they say it celebrates? They say the resurrection, right? What did Yeshua ask us to celebrate? His death, his sacrifice.
Hmm.
His sacrifice. So we are taking his sacrifice, which he commanded us to remember in that day. So on Passover, when we do this, when you do this in remembrance of me. When you eat Passover, do so in remembrance of me. Why? Because the following day on the 14th, he was going to be killed. He was going to be the Passover lamb. And so we take that command to honor our Lord and remember his sacrifice, and we change it by our own decree, our own will, and our own wisdom into a command to honor his resurrection. He gave us a day to celebrate his resurrection. It's called the Feast of First Fruits. Paul even talks about it. Paul says that Yeshua is the first fruits to God of the resurrection. Well, what's the first fruits? It's the giving of the harvest. Yeshua is the first one to be resurrected, and then many brothers adopted by God, that is the kingdom of God, will be resurrected later on when he returns. So he's the first fruits. First fruits is literally when he resurrected, and it's the celebration of that. But we've changed that to change Passover into a celebration that we desire.
You know, I think the whole concept of how the church has turned this idea of communion into such a somber event, such a very serious, and you know, the time and reflecting on what the Messiah did, of course it is serious, but it is a feast. It is a time that we're supposed to be rejoicing because, wow, look what he's done for us.
Mm-hmm.
And I think whenever you look at communion versus what the early church did in partaking of a Passover, there's a great book that I read called Pagan Christianity by Jordan
I was
Marlin.
about to mention it. Go ahead. Go
and
ahead.
and it kind of dives into this whole concept that the first century believers partook of communion in a full meal. They
Mm-hmm.
sat down and they were sitting around eating a full meal together in remembrance of what the Messiah did, and this was Passover. They were keeping Passover because Yeshua was the Passover lamb, and I think this whole concept of a communion, it really has justified not obeying and keeping the commandments of the feasts.
Mm-hmm.
Because now we can do a little cracker and a cup of wine. It's a lot more affordable to, you know, feed your whole community, you know, your little cracker and cup versus a
Yeah.
big feast. But
Right.
you know, it's just so tragic because whenever you see all the images in Passover, it's beautiful. You know, it's so amazing, and
Mm-hmm.
we have replaced that with the cracker and the little sippy cup of juice, and
Mm-hmm.
and that's so, you know, I really,
Sad.
it's just sad. And and you know, I would like you to kind of maybe expound on something that has always been associated with the process of taking communion.
Mm-hmm.
um but Paul talks about how, you know, don't partake of this in an unworthy manner. So what is he talking about in relation to communion and not partaking in an unworthy manner? And how does that relate to actually keeping it as believers in Passover?
So, first of all, there's a couple things I think that could mean. First, when if you study the context, I think pagan Christianity talks about. I actually quote that book in my book, when it talks about the changing the Eucharist or the Passover into the Eucharist and communion, that's actually the book I quote sometimes. But anyways, it's a great book. But um, when we talk about I just lost track. I'm sorry. What was your question again? I apologize.
Oh, Paul talking about partaking in
Oh, in a somber.
communion
Yeah,
in a somber way
to
or an unworthy manner, and how
yeah,
it's kind of been pushed onto us during communion. You better get your you know, ducks in a row, or you're going to get zapped. You know?
right. Well, first of all, I'll make the point that if you're rejecting Passover for communion, you are keeping it in an unworthy manner. because you're denying all the commandments of God. And that's literally the definition of keeping in an unworthy manner. That's not what Paul was warning about, because to Paul, it would have been crazy. Like, I think he would have been like, I think if you went back in time, he'd be like, wait, are you telling me they use my writings to prove that they don't have to keep the Torah? Are you joking? You know? Um, but yeah, I think this concept of keeping an unworthy manner has been used to abuse and to beat down people. And the truth is, the Passover is a feast of freedom. It's a celebration. It's a celebration of joy. I think that's talking to Gentiles and saying, don't celebrate the Lord's table like you would a pagan feast. At a pagan feast, they would get drunk. They would eat until they threw up. They would get up and carouse, if you know what I mean. They would sexual acts, that kind of thing. And so I believe he's saying, don't partake of the Lord's table in a way. Don't partake of the Lord's table in a way like you would at your pagan feasts. Ironically, that's what we do with Easter, right? In my book, I show there's a German linguist who proved that the word Easter comes from Eostri, which is a pagan fertility goddess. And that's why we have Easter bunnies and Easter egg hunts and sunrise Easter services. Why do we worship at sunrise? Well, because she was worshipped at sunrise. Anyways, I don't get too much into that, but I do show that the word Easter is proven to come from Eostri. And so we have mixed our pagan traditions with the Lord's feast. And that is a shame. That is such a shame. You remember the parable I told last time about the wife, and she said at the end, after he had found out that he was celebrating her ex's anniversary every year, she said, I do it for you. I do it to honor you. And, that's how I look at Easter. We're looking at our Lord saying, I do it for you. I do it to honor you. And it just makes me want to cry. Like, why? Why do we think it's okay to dishonor our master, our Messiah, who died for us? He died to set us free. He married us. He betrothed us to himself. He set up this feast that we can have joy and freedom. And then we take it, we throw it in the trash. We stomp on it. We dump out the blood and sacrifices to pagan gods on top of it. We think it's honoring to him? No way. No way. Anyways, I'm sorry. I get worked up a little bit. Yes, the Last Supper is Passover. Yes, it says it over. Go back if you question that. This is a question covered in my book. Go back and read the gospel accounts. So let me say this: if you are saying that the Last Supper was not a Passover, then you're actually saying the Gospels are wrong. I know that's hard, and I'm not trying to be mean, and I'm not trying to set up a straw man, but that's what you're saying, because the Gospels say emphatically, Matthew, Mark, and Luke say emphatically that Yeshua ate the Passover and that he slaughtered a Passover lamb. More accurately, the disciples slaughtered it for him. John says that the Jews, not the disciples and not Yeshua, kept a Passover after he died. The Jews, as I explained earlier, was a reference to the Pharisees. So here's my question. Was Yeshua placed on a stake and roasted over a fire? No. Was his blood poured out on the altar? No. No, not literally. No. There is a theory out there. Okay, let's not get into that. Was he killed at the altar and his blood poured out? No. The theory you're thinking of, I think, is the Ark of the Covenant, the blood dripping down. I won't say what I think about that, but was he killed at the altar in the temple? No. Was he impaled by a stake? No, he was crucified. Was he eaten? No. This is how a Passover lamb is consumed. So what makes you think he has to die in the exact same time? Where does it say that in Scripture? Nowhere. There's one verse which Paul says Yeshua is our Pesach, which is our Passover lamb, which I will agree with you 100%. Yeshua is our Passover lamb. That does not mean he has to die exactly like a Passover lamb died. It does not mean he has to die at the same time a Passover lamb died, because he's not our lamb to sacrifice. He's God's lamb to sacrifice. So God's lamb is different than our lamb. God's lamb was the Messiah. Our lamb is an animal. Our lamb is placed on a stake and roasted over fire and eaten. God's lamb was crucified on a cross. His blood was poured out onto the earth on, most likely, I believe, the Mount of Olives, and he later resurrected. Okay? Our lamb is much more precious. Our lamb died during the day of the 14th in connection to the covenant of Abraham. I mean, God's lamb, sorry. God's lamb, I got confused there. God's lamb died on the day of the 14th, in connection to the Feast of Abraham. Now, if you said, well, the Pharisees would have seen that as Yeshua dying as the lamb, I would have said no, because they killed him. But okay, you could argue that that's a sign to the Pharisees. That's fine. But remember that the Pharisees were breaking the Torah, and I show that in my book. And so it's extremely difficult, in my opinion, to argue for a theory which would only be proven by breaking the law. Okay, so if the Pharisees were not breaking the Torah, then your argument would be completely invalid. So, and I'm not saying argument as in like we're arguing. I'm just saying like your statement, the question was making. It's a very good question. I'm glad that person asked it. It's in my book.
So for those of you who are watching, John wrote in and asked, "Is the Last Supper the Passover, and how could Yeshua eat the Passover if he was to be the Passover lamb
Exactly.
that was then killed the next day?" So, back to your kind of explanation is he ate the Passover, but he could also be the Passover the next day because he didn't have to be slaughtered at the altar and go through the process that the Pharisees would have put their sacrifice lamb through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but he was, there are some similarities. He was inspected by a priest. John, a lot of people forget, was a priest. He inspected Yeshua and said, "Behold the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world." So he was inspected by a priest. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter. He was quiet like a lamb is. His blood was poured out to the earth, just not at the altar. So there are some similarities as well. In fact, there are so many similarities to the Passover lamb and the Feast of Passover that's why Paul calls him the Passover Lamb of God. Okay, I completely agree with that statement. I just don't believe in the theory behind it. And the danger is that you're insisting that, and that was a guy. I'm sorry. I thought for some reason I was reading quickly and I thought it was a woman. He's not him or this, but this theory is insisting that the Synoptic Gospels are wrong because of how we think the Gospel of John is saying something. So let me rephrase that. We believe in theory the Gospel of John is saying one thing. So we're insisting that the other three Gospels are wrong in what they actually say. So this is dangerous. This is an example of what's it called, eisegesis, where you basically read into the text what you want. This is exactly what this theory is. This is eisegesis. This is saying, this is what I want this to say, therefore, this is what happened. That's not what the gospel says.
So I don't know if John necessarily was promoting the doctrine, but I definitely know what you're talking about with the whole idea of them saying since he died the next day, that means the Last Supper was not Passover. And that's kind of
right.
The theory that Isaac's talking about is this whole idea of the Last Supper is not a Passover meal, and it was just the Last Supper that he had before the Passover season happened. I just wanted to explain that a little bit for people for clarification about what kind of eisegesis you're talking about.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Sometimes I've been studying this so much that I forget to explain the more basic elements to it, and I apologize for that. And by the way, I'm not saying in any way that John actually believed that. And, we have proof of that because the Quintodesmans, they actually said John and John's disciple Polycarp kept Passover on the evening of the 14th. So that completely dismisses this theory. So John in no way said that we should keep Passover on the 15th. With the Jews, that is the leadership of the Jews, the Pharisees, which later became the rabbis, which now are led, the Orthodox. Now, some people say, well, I keep Passover on the 15th because I want to keep it with my brothers, the Jews. My response would be, that's great. I believe they're your brothers. I believe they're my brothers. I am a Jew, but I'll keep it with my Messiah.
Now, I do have a comment in the chat
Hmm.
that I'd like you to kind of address, but
Sure.
um, someone wrote in saying, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Passover is a yearly remembrance feast, but the Lord's Supper, as done by most churches, can be done at any time as a remembrance of Yeshua's death. Um, Now, I know we kind of approached this with the idea of communion, but
Mhm.
what I know this idea of the Lord's Supper is something that can be kept at any time versus Passover, which is a yearly thing. So, how do you kind of address this conception in the church?
So the answer would be the context. What's the context of what he's saying? They're eating a Passover meal. And he says, when you do this, what's the context of this? Passover. When you do Passover, do it in remembrance of me. So my dad takes me to a baseball game every year. It's the first game of the year of his favorite team. And every year we go growing up, I'm making this story up, obviously. I don't like sports. So every year we go to this baseball game and we watch it, the first game of the year of his favorite team. And one day, as he's getting older, he finds out he has cancer, and it's the last game we get to celebrate together. And we're sitting in the stands and watching the game, and he gets his misty eyes in his misty, look in his eyes. And he looks at me and says, "Son, when you do this, remember me." And I say, "Okay, Dad." And then when he dies, I put a chair in my backyard. I put a TV up, and I sit back there and I drink a beer, and I say, "Dad, I'm remembering you just like you said." No, no, I'm not. I'm doing something completely different. Now, if that's the way you want to remember, that's fine, but you're not doing what your dad asked. Yeshua didn't ask us to eat any meal. If the context of that is any meal, then we could argue that any feast is the Lord's Day or communion or whatever, and then every meal becomes the communion, and then it's not special anymore. It has no meaning. But remember how we talked about Passover is the anniversary. It is the betrothal of us to him. It is the celebration of our freedom. It is the ultimate feast of our Lord. It is his feast. It's called the feast of the Lord. It's his feast. So when we do that context, when you do this in remembrance of me. We do this. That is, we keep Passover. We do it in remembrance of him. You can remember what Yeshua's sacrifice however you want, but don't call it the Lord's Supper. Don't call it communion as described by Paul, because that was just a word Paul was using. Don't call it Passover. Just say you want to remember the Lord's sacrifice. It's fine. It's not a sin. It's not a sin to remember the Lord's sacrifice. There's nothing wrong with drinking a little bit of grape juice or a little bit of wine or eating a cracker. Just don't reject the commandments of God. What did Yeshua say to the Pharisees? You forsake the commandments of God because of your traditions. If you reject Passover because of the Lord's Supper, then you are being a Pharisee. You are rejecting the commandments of God for traditions. Instead, keep the commandments, keep Passover. And if you happen to be at a church that keeps communion, take it if you want. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not hurting anybody. It's not, just recognize this is not, the verses they quote will be out of context, and just recognize it's not what Yeshua talked about, but you're doing it as another way to honor him, and that's fine. It's a tradition. There's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when our traditions replace the commandments of God. So there's nothing wrong with going to church on Sunday. The New Testament church met every day of the week. So it would be impossible to prove scripturally that you shouldn't meet on a Sunday. It's not possible because they did. But what would be impossible to prove is that you should reject the Sabbath for a Sunday worship. And that's when, once again, when we reject God's commandments for our own traditions, that's when Yeshua has a problem with what we're doing. Nothing wrong with traditions. Hanukkah is a tradition. I celebrate Hanukkah. That's my cat. I celebrate Hanukkah, and I love it. It's fun. It's fun for my my 4-year-old daughter. My 1-year-old next year, she'll be old enough to understand. She'll have a blast. They love Hanukkah. 8 days of gifts and stuff. It's fun, but it's just tradition. It is remembering some sacrifices of some men who fought in Israel a long time ago, but it's just tradition. And so nothing wrong with tradition as long as you don't reject the commandments. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
Would you want to continue on with another topic, or you want me to ask some more questions?
No, actually, go ahead and ask some questions. I'm good.
Okay. So this will probably be kind of like a two-part question. These two people, what they're asking ties in together.
Okay.
But Brian is asking, I'm really new to this, and as a Gentile believer, can you explain again how we are to celebrate Passover?
Sure. So there's a few commandments. The commandment we've talked about the most tonight has been the lamb, and which is kind of ironic since we actually can't sacrifice the lamb. So let me clarify. Uh, we cannot sacrifice the lamb for Passover. Okay. Um, but we can eat lamb if we want, or we can eat another meal. You can eat steak or whatever, as long as you don't eat pork. Um, actually, I know I heard Monty Judah say one time that someone he invited someone to his Passover and they brought a ham. They didn't know, they didn't mean to do anything wrong, but he was like, oh no, what do we do with this? And they took it out of the house quickly and didn't touch it. Uh, so don't eat ham, don't eat pork. But anyways, eat whatever meat you desire, but as long as it's kosher. Um, and you're commanded to eat unleavened bread. You must not eat leavened bread. So leavened bread is bread with yeast in it. So it's very important. You do not eat bread with yeast in it. And that's explained in my book. You eat unleavened bread. You can buy unleavened bread, which is a lot easier. Or if you want tasty unleavened bread, which is delicious, you can make your own unleavened bread. Lex Meyer, his wife Amanda, she made some amazing unleavened bread one year, and I wanted to just pay her to make me some because it was so tasty, so good. It was better than it was homemade bread, so it was delicious. Anyways, and you also have to eat bitter herbs. You remember the slavery. So it reminds you of the slavery of our fathers in Egypt. It also reminds you of the slavery you had before you were saved.
Isaac,
And
real quick,
so,
if you could dive into
mhm,
maybe a little bit further about unleavened bread and what unleavened bread represents and why we need to get that out of our house during the week of unleavened
sure.
bread.
So leaven is basically yeast. Long story short, in the ancient days, they had a loaf of bread, or they had a dough, which we would call today a sourdough, and they would leave it in the air, and it would actually gather yeast from the air, and it would leaven over time. And what you would do is you would take a lump of that dough, and you would make some more dough and mix it together, and that lump of dough would leaven your entire loaf that you were making. So Paul talks about this, for instance, when he talks about leaven. But once a year before Passover, actually technically, well, that's a whole other subject which take like 20 minutes to explain. But before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, technically after Passover, but before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we throw all of our leavened bread out of the house. We remove all our yeast. I also get rid of beer just because it has yeast in it. Um, how deep do you want to go down that rabbit trail? Do you want to include pasta, whatever? People decide every year what they want to do. But you get rid of all the leaven in your house, and then you have unleavened bread. Unleavened bread is specifically bread made without yeast. It's usually made very quickly. They do certain things like rolling it and smashing it to where it doesn't collect, doesn't rise. Although technically, it would take hours, if not days, to take in yeast. That's more of a tradition. So bread that puffs up a little bit, like a tiny bit, over an hour when you're making it, that's not leavened. Leavened would take hours and days to get. It takes like a week to make unleavened bread leaven, really, because we don't have the ancient days. They didn't have starter kits. People are like, well, I can leaven my bread in a few hours. Oh, sure you can. Get that nice little starter kit that you order from Amazon, and you can make some leavened bread. Yep, that's what Moses did. He got on Google and he typed in Amazon, and he had to order a cell phone first so he could text all the Israelites about the Exodus. And then because most people think they left the very night that the Exodus happened. They think that the Exodus happened the very night of the death of the firstborn. And I'm like, how did he tell 3 million people to leave in like an hour? That doesn't make sense. Um, anyways, uh, so we make unleavened bread or we buy unleavened bread. Grocery stores might sell it. Warning, it is extremely expensive. Prices are way jacked up. You eat bitter herbs. We do horseradish, and you eat other things like egg and horseradish. Horseret, I think is how you pronounce it. It's like kind of apple and cinnamon and stuff. And I think we usually have latkes, which is like a hash brown almost. But unleavened bread, wine, and bitter herbs, the three elements that we have to have in any Passover meal. I keep a Seder just because it's fun and tradition. Once again, it's just tradition. You don't have to have a Seder meal. Lion and Lamb, I don't remember their website, but if you type in lionandlamb.org, they have a Haggadah for like $8, which gives you literally every single step-by-step instruction on how to keep Passover. It's like $8. It includes the lyrics to the songs. They even have like a CD of pre-recorded songs that you can play if you want to sing along with it. And they have a video of a family. Sorry, I'm laughing. It's Monty Judah's family keeping Passover as an instruction. So Jake and I, it's kind of a inside joke. Anyways, so it's they have all kinds of products like that, and there's tons of Messianic Haggadahs out there you can probably get for free. You can buy them. Lion and Lamb has them. So anyways, that's the basic instruction on how to keep Passover. But honestly, it would be like an hour-long teaching at minimum if I really talked about how to keep Passover. Unleavened bread is bread made without yeast. Long story short. Did that answer your questions?
Yeah.
Or their questions?
And of course, the whole concept that, it's an object lesson. Unleavened bread and getting the leaven out is representing getting sin out of your life.
Oh yeah,
And
I
that,
go into that in my book.
I was wanting you to jump on that a little
Okay,
bit, because
yeah. So
sometimes this whole process of getting leaven out is like, why do I need to get rid of bread? What in the world? But whenever you understand it's an object lesson, it goes, it turns that light bulb on.
yeah, exactly. So as a side note, real quick, 30 seconds. A lot of people claim that because John uses the word artos or arton, the Greek word for what they say is leavened bread, when it describes the meal, the Passover meal, that must mean that it's not Passover because it's describing leavened bread. There's a problem with this. The Greek word used to describe the showbread in the Gospels and in the book of Hebrews is the word arton or artos. And we learned from the Torah that the showbread was unleavened bread. So we learned from that the word artos or arton, depending on how you pronounce it, which version you're reading, that's actually a reference to bread in general, not just leavened bread. I wanted to mention that because I just thought of that. Now, on to the more important topic. There's a commandment that says that on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you're to remove the leaven from your house. Actually, all Israel is supposed to remove into the whole land. So what you do is you search the house and you find the leaven. A lot of times the dad will hide like little bits of cracker or pieces of bread around the house. And then you go around with like a flashlight and like a feather duster trying to find all the leaven. And your kids are like searching for like a little treasure hunt to try to find the leaven. It's really cute. My wife, Anne, has a lot of memories from her dad teaching her to do that growing up, learning that. But anyways, you remove the leaven from the house. Well, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, I believe it is, that he compares leaven to sin. He talks about how a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And he's actually referencing sexual immorality. And there's actually multiple meanings to this. So I'm going to talk about one meaning. Yeshua is also compared to unleavened bread. But leavened bread is offered with a Thanksgiving offering. So I would never say that leaven only represents sin. When it comes to removing leaven from our houses, that's when you would say, okay, it represents sin. So we know that Passover is linked to salvation. And the Feast of Unleavened Bread is about entering the promised land. Before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we remove the leaven from our house. Well, when do you begin to remove sin? Before or after salvation? After. That's why the commandment says after Passover, before the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you remove leaven from your house. Now, that being said, you do not in any way eat leavened bread with your Passover, only unleavened bread. But you remove the unleavened bread, which represents sin, from your life, from the house. And this is a picture of you're saved, then you remove the sin, then one day we will enter the promised land for the greater Exodus. And then we'll be a pure and holy bride. We'll be spotless and pure and perfect. But so we see a word picture there, the removing of the leaven. Now, what's interesting is that guess what happens the rest of the year? You eat leavened bread. And just like we all too often, we go back like a dog to its vomit, the Bible says. We return to our sin. But every year is that reminder, throw out that leaven, cleanse your hearts. Remember the sacrifice of your Messiah. Remember what great things he did for you. Cleanse your hearts. There's another teaching as well, which I like, which equates the unleavened bread with the teachings of men, or the leavened bread with the teachings of men. Because Yeshua warned the disciples to not be like the leaven of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, which it says later they understood he was talking about their teachings. And so that's also a great teaching, to remember that we should throw out the traditions of men and we should keep the commandments of God. And every year kind of go through and question those traditions, not the commandments, but those traditions. And get rid of them. Also, we should not celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread or Passover based solely on tradition. We should base it on the Passover feasts and unleavened bread commandments. I was kidding.
So somebody was writing in asking, okay, I have an issue getting all of it out of my house because I'm not the only person that lives here. And I know that's something I dealt with in whenever I've been trying to keep Passovers. I had a roommate or somebody who doesn't keep the feasts. What do you tell to somebody who wants to practice this, wants to get the leaven out of their house and keep Passover, yet they are in a situation where they can't get rid of the yeast?
So that's a great question. First of all, I would say if they're a very honoring person of your beliefs, you could ask them, would they be willing to remove the leaven? They might say no. Okay, well, would you be willing to take it into your bedroom? No? Okay. Well, then I'm going to eat Passover in my bedroom or whatever. You could eat Passover in your bedroom where there's no leaven, because that's technically your domain at that point, because the house is common domain, so to speak. For instance, I can't go into the grocery store and start just throwing away all their bread. It's Passover! Ha ha ha! Yeah! I'd be arrested, right? So that's common domain. It's not my place of authority. In the same way, you don't have authority in their bedroom, and if it's not your house, you definitely don't have authority in the house. So what you can do is obey the commandments in the areas, in the sphere of your influence, in the areas of your authority. So your bedroom, for instance, can be completely clean. If I was at someone's house and they insisted on eating bread the night of Passover, I would remove myself from the table and I would be like, I love you, and I'll see you later, mom or dad or whoever, grandma, grandpa. And then I would go into my bedroom and I would eat apart from them, because I don't want leavened bread to be around my Passover meal. So that's one way you can do it. If you can ask them, hey, can you take it into your room? Can we get rid of it? I'll pay for it. Some people believe that you could put it in your garage for the time and then bring it back in when you're done. I disagree with that, but I've done that in the past at different years. Each year you kind of learn new things and decide new things. But you might say, can we put it in the garage at least, to get it out of the house technically for 7 days, for 8 days if you're doing it before Passover. So anyways, that's what I would do.
Yeah. We have another question coming in. How important is it to actually eat lamb? Because I know a lot of vegans and people who keep the feasts who are really awesome people, but they don't eat meat.
Great question. So we cannot sacrifice a lamb. We cannot, as I explained earlier. So actually, you don't have to eat lamb. I love the taste of lamb. I do. I love meat in general. I love steak and chicken. I used to love pork, but I love meat in general. So I like to joke I'm a vegetarian in between meals. So, uh, uh, so I eat lots of lamb for Passover, but you don't have to. In the kingdom, I'm going to suggest that there will not be such a thing as vegetarians, because everybody will bring sacrifices and everybody will partake of them. In the kingdom, we'll be able to actually sacrifice lambs for Passover, and because of that, we'll be eating lamb at Passover as commanded. At this point, because we cannot keep that command, even if we were in Israel, we would not be allowed to keep that command. And so because of that, we don't have to eat lamb. I eat it because of tradition, because it's a joy to remember. But I would say if it was between sacrificing a lamb and not eating a lamb, I would not eat a lamb, because I don't want to worship demons. So I don't need to go into that again. But yeah, so no, vegans can keep Passover as well. They just shouldn't push their beliefs on someone else. If someone else wants to eat lamb in front of them, it's a feast of freedom. So you are free to eat how you desire, as long as you eat bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and wine. Drink wine. By the way, you don't have to eat bitter herbs constantly. There's like a section of Passover where you eat bitter herbs, and then that's it. You're not like eating it throughout the whole night, like, oh, this horseradish is horrible. You eat a little bit, and then you remember the bitterness of slavery and the bitterness of sin, and then you go on to the rest of the feast. But yeah, if you are a vegan, my only thing would be to say, don't judge other people. If they want to eat lamb, it's their feast of freedom. Let them eat lamb. If you want to drink wine and they want to drink grape juice, that's fine too. It's a feast of freedom. So don't judge other people.
The last time we were keeping our Passover meal with our fellowship, I think we got like a horseradish sauce or something, and me and John, we actually like horseradish.
Oh,
And
that's funny.
so we were dipping the horseradish. Oh, this is we weren't really feeling the bondage and the bitterness because it tasted too good to us. But so if that's the case, maybe get something a little bit more bitter than than kind of like Arby's sauce or something.
Right? Yeah. No, can we get some ketchup in here too while we're at it? Yeah, that would be bad. But obviously, you wouldn't know that until you keep it, right? So it's kind of like as you keep Torah, you discover. So you didn't know that you were going to enjoy that part of the feast so much, and now you're like, okay, now I know that. So next Passover, what am I going to get? Let me research what's bitter. And people eat eggs. We have eggs to remember the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, all kinds of things. You take the horseret and you build like little pyramids to remember the pyramids, which is funny because they were most likely built like 1,000 years before the children of Israel were enslaved, but that's neither here nor there. So just little traditions like that. We got another question?
We have another question coming in from Lisa, and it asks, if Passover is the physical removing of sin and Yom Kippur is the spiritual repentance of sin, or would Sukkot be that, since that requires appearing before Yahweh? So I guess kind of maybe if you could explain the difference between what is Passover representing when it comes to sin being removed, and what is the fall feast and Yom Kippur representing when sin's atoned for? Why is there a difference there?
Yeah. So great question, by the way. So Sukkot, you have the spring feast and the fall feasts. Technically, you have the spring feast, a summer feast, and a fall feast. But however you want to count Shavuot or Pentecost. But so Passover is the removing of sin. Is a symbolism of salvation, like we talked about. The Day of Atonement, actually, it's the Day of Atonements, technically. If I remember correctly, it's plural in Hebrew. I think I'll have to go back and look at that. The Day of Atonement is actually about judgment. So remember that Yeshua talks over and over about judgment, the last days. The prophets talk a lot about judgment, the day of the Lord. The judgment day we see in Revelation. Judgment day is going to be wherever the whole world is judged. That's the Day of Atonement. Paul says that Yeshua will return at the last trump. The last trump is a Jewish reference to the Feast of Trumpets, which is the first day of the 7th month. The 10th day of the 7th month is the Day of Atonement. It's the only commanded day that we fast. Okay, it's the only commanded fast in the entirety of Judaism. We love to eat or I'll say Christianity as well, obviously, because not everybody's a Jew. We love to eat, but we have to fast one day. But we fast in remembrance of that sin. I personally believe that the Day of Atonement is when Adam and Eve fell. That's Book of Isaac, chapter 2, completely theoretical. I can show you why I believe that, but not now. But it's a theory. I would never argue about it because, it's a theory. I can't prove it. So the Day of Atonement is about judgment versus Passover is about not receiving judgment. So now we may not receive judgment on atonement as well. We might be saved from that. We'll still be judged, though. We just won't receive the punishment. So atonement is about judgment, and Passover is about salvation from judgment, being saved from that and not receiving that. It's about salvation. So, make sense?
So Passover is about being betrothed, which in the those days is equatable to marriage. Even if you're betrothed, you are basically married.
Right.
And then the Day of
It's not
Atonement
physically.
would be when he decides if you are a bride worth taking in or somebody who was lawless and was put out. So that would be that instance where it was decided whether that betrothed bride had made herself clean and had prepared herself versus somebody who'd fallen by the wayside. And that's
Right.
when that decision is kind of going to be made, is the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes, there is another reference to that, which is Sukkot is the wedding feast. So most of the references to Yeshua are talking about people being cast into outer darkness is a reference to the wedding feast. So they would feast at night, and they would have everything was lit. Something I learned is that the ancient Near East, and even in Yeshua's time, they were never in darkness. When they slept, they would light a candle or a lamp, actual lamp, not a candle. They would light a lamp and put it up on a bushel. That's why Yeshua said no one takes a candle and covers it, puts a bushel over it, because he was saying what they would do is, like a lampstand, they would take a basket, and they put a lamp on top of it, and that would light the room at night when they slept. The Jews, actually, the whole people over there, the Near Easterners, Far East being like Asia, but the Near Easterners were terrified of the dark. I mean, think about, they didn't have street lamps and flashlights, and they have machine guns. So you walk around the dark in the desert, and all of a sudden a lion jumps up and gets you. Boom, you're dead. Cobras sting. I don't know if cobras are over in Israel. I'm just saying, there was all kinds of crazy things that could happen to you. So they were terrified of it. You have robbers, you have all kinds of things. So they even slept in the daylight. Or not in the daylight, they slept in the light. And so Yeshua, when he references terror, when he references torment, he always talks about darkness, because that's what they associated with darkness, is torment and terror. And being cast into outer darkness is a reference to being thrown out of a feast and not being allowed in. So it's people who are being cast out of the feast. And the feast, I believe right now, is Sukkot. And so there's a reference to the Day of Atonement and a reference to Sukkot, both, to answer her other question about Sukkot.
Okay, this is our last question coming in,
Yep.
and it's kind of from Sean, and he's asking, will we be going backwards in the kingdom with the return of sacrifices? I mean, I get we are commanded, but I am having trouble getting my head wrapped around it at the moment. How is Yeshua the last sacrifice for sin, and yet there will be sacrifices in the kingdom?
Okay. Well, I get what he's saying. I would never say obeying God's commands is going backwards, but I see what he's saying, because he's viewing the evolution of Judaism and Christianity, and he's talking about going backwards in time, so to speak. Okay, so first of all, it's a misnomer that Yeshua was the only sacrifice for sin. There were sacrifices for unintentional sin, but only unintentional sin in the Torah. Now, there was a sacrifice that may have been for intentional sin for the high priest, but that's another subject. But for the everyday people, I sound like Hillary Clinton there, man. Excuse me. For the average person, there was no sacrifice for intentional sins. There was only a sacrifice for unintentional sins. Yeshua's sacrifice as the Lamb of God was for intentional sins. In nowhere in the Bible does it say that he was the last sacrifice. Nowhere does it say that there will no longer be sacrifices. In fact, Ezekiel says that if the covenant of Phineas, which is the covenant of Levi, also in the Bible, I think one of the books calls it the covenant of Levi. It says the covenant of Phineas is done away with, then he'll forget his covenant with night and day. And the covenant of Phineas is also linked, I believe, either Isaiah or Ezekiel, to the covenant of David. Now, what gives our Messiah the right to be king? The covenant of David. So if you remove the covenant of Phineas, which is tied to the covenant of David, and then you have to remove the covenant of David, then the Messiah is not king anymore. That's a problem. That's a big problem. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Our God is a covenant keeper. He does not break his oath. He does not lie. He keeps his words. He tells the truth. Now, I'm not in any way saying these people are saying God lies. I know they're not saying that. I'm just saying God keeps his word. God's a covenant keeper. So the Ezekiel prophesies that one day the sons of Zadok, who were descendants of Phineas, would return and they would serve as priests before the Lord under the Messiah, by the way. The Messiah is the king. Now, people like to quote the book of Hebrews when they talk about the priesthood, but what they don't realize is the book of Hebrews says that if Yeshua were here on earth, he would not be a priest. I'm going to rephrase that. I'm going to say it again. If Yeshua were here on earth, he would not be a priest. Why? Because the priests were of Levi. Yeshua was of Judah. He wasn't of Levi. Now, technically, I think his mother's mother was, but his mother, when she married a Jew, became a Jew because you became a member of the tribe, whatever tribe you married into. And so Yeshua was born to a Jew, not a Levite. So it's not going backwards. It's going back to obedience. And I would say it's laying the foundation, setting it straight. Right now, the foundation is crooked. Here's our foundation. And going back to Torah is just doing this. It's not going backwards. It's setting the foundation straight. And so I understand what he's saying, but think of it as returning to the worship of the one true God. I would encourage this man to study the sacrifices, and you'll realize that they were worship. If you look up, like when David talks in the Psalms about the sacrifice of praise, which many people quote, that's an actual sacrifice. There's an actual sacrifice of thanksgiving, So go study the sacrifices and think about this. And this is what I'm going to end with. When you invite someone over to your house to eat with you, to fellowship with you, you have food on the table. You have wine or drink on the table. You have bread on the table. So what does God command at his altar? He commands that you bring unleavened bread. He commands that you have food on the table, the meat. And he has the wine on the table as well. There's wine poured out. He invites us to come and dine with him. Paul talks about those who share in the sacrifices. The context is sacrifice. You're eating of it. So would you disdain the gift of your king? And of course, the answer is no, you would not. The guy who asked this question, I'm sure he would not. But I'm asking a rhetorical question. Would you disdain the gift of your king to come and eat with him, to dine with him? That's what a sacrifice is. It's an invitation to the house of the king to come and eat at his table. So I will be honored to offer sacrifice at the table of my king. And I can't wait to do it, to smell that smell and to worship that way. Mm-hmm. It's not going backwards. It's going forwards to his kingdom.
And on top of that, the fact that there's more than one type of sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
Sacrifices of the wave offering of just there's a lot to it, and it's something definitely to study out. I know the Christianese teaches that Jesus was the end to all sacrifices, and he was the end to all sacrifices for sin. He only needed to die once for our sin atonement, because he was the Passover lamb that ended all the need for Passover lambs, but there are many different sacrifices throughout the scriptures that aren't referring to what he came and he lived out and fulfilled when he returned. And we see keeping of the feasts in the kingdom age, and it's only after when the new heavens and the new earth are created that all of that is ended, because we won't need we won't need it anymore, forever, for whatever reason. It's something I'll need to study out myself. But
well, that's when the new heaven and new earth are done away with, when there's no longer sin. The law is required because of sin. So when there's no longer sin, we're perfect. We'll automatically keep the Torah. We won't need a law to tell us to do it. So if you have any more questions, I would encourage you to check out my book on Amazon. It's called The Passover from Abraham to Yeshua in the Early Church by me, Isaac C. Stropes. Is that backwards to you? That looks backwards to me.
oh no, it's coming through on my
Okay.
end at least.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, that's probably it's reversed. So I'm leaning right now on your end, but I'm leaning left. Anyway, okay, I'm sorry. Anyways, go to Amazon, check it out. If I want to say this real quick, if you are how do I say this? If you are financially incapable of spending the $13.99 or the $2.99 for the Kindle version, message me and I may be able to do something about that. As far as my book goes. So you can contact me, Isaac C. Stropes on Facebook. Like the page, and you can message me there or comment. If you have any questions, please feel free to post there or message me. I'm happy to answer any questions. There's another video, which is a sister video to this that Jake has, which he shared about Abraham. But yeah, please, if you have Kindle Unlimited, by the way, I made my book free on Kindle Unlimited. So if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read my book for free. So check it out. Let me know if you have any questions. Like I said, if you really are too tight and you don't have the $2.99 and I speak in sincerity because I grew up in a very poor household. So if you don't have the $2.99 and there are people out there who don't, let me know, please. I would be happy to serve you. So and the reason I'm charging for my book is I'm actually using the money for other ministry ideas, but I can't talk about that right now. But just so you know, I'm not trying to profit off of people, because I know people who get accused of that, and it really drives me up the walls. So anyways,
Well,
I
thank you
appreciate you
so
having
much,
me.
Isaac. Yeah, thank you for coming on and sharing with us about the Passover, about the anniversary
Mm.
that we're keeping with our Messiah every year. And as we grow and as we do it, we're just learning, and we're understanding more and more about how much it reveals about him and who he is, and it's very important for our listeners, and for us to have someone like you on to dive into it, because it's so fascinating and so important. So
Thanks.
thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
All right, everyone. We have an exciting show coming up this Thursday. John Hall is going to be back with NIC TV with an episode, and be on the lookout for that. And of course, we're going to be at the conference in Ohio, the Take on the World conference. Looking forward to seeing everyone there who's able to make it. And if you can't make it, you can stream it live through nystv.org. It's our subscription network. I think it's about $8 to subscribe, and you can watch the whole conference. And we have all our documentaries and stuff that are going to be on there. We're also going to have a special episode of Virtual House Church, which is this coming Friday night. And I know the past few Virtual House Church, Rob's not been able to make it, but we're going to have the full panel, just like we had at the conference, the Declaring the End from the Beginning conference. And it's going to be really awesome having all the speakers on there to kind of go through the Torah portion and answer your questions. So be sure to tune in for that. It's going to be awesome. And that's pretty much it. So good night, everybody. Thank you for watching, and take care. Shalom.